So there was a lot made about Manchester United's transfer dealings this summer. They signed Jadon Sancho, they signed Rafael Varane, they just signed Cristiano Ronaldo. For the love of all things holy, I don't know why they did, but we won't talk about that. Instead, I want to talk about what I feel to be their big need, which is a more defined number six. We call it a defensive mid, a DM, a six. It's a bit more to it than that. When we look at the player Fred is, the player McTominay is, and the player Nemanja Matic is, only one of them is a real quality defensive minded midfielder. And it, unfortunately for Manchester United, is the one who's 33 years old and doesn't really have the physical capacity to play that position anymore against high intensity, physically fit Premier League teams such as Wolverhampton Wanderers. And that's Matic. He's the only real quality one they've got. They need another Nemanja Matic. Easier said than done, of course. But in the interim, in the time between seasons, I suppose you could say, rather than relying on Matic every week, he does play occasionally, but rather than that, they've doubled up with Fred and McTominay in a double pivot or double six. You could probably call it closer to that. It's a pretty conservative approach when it's those two playing, and a pretty strong approach. I know those two aren't the biggest. They're not a huge. They don't have a huge following among the Man United fan base. They're not really rated universally. But between them, they offer, I think, enough protection for Bruno Fernandes. And you have to understand that Fernandes needs a lot of protection. He's not really a midfielder. You couldn't call that a 4-3-3. It's effectively a 4-2-4. Minimum, it's a 4-2-3-1. I would call it a 4-2-4. Now, when you have Pogba within that double six, you suddenly have a player who is naturally very expressive, naturally very progressive, very talented, infinitely talented, an incredible football player, but also one who doesn't have that. I don't. He is disciplined, but in an offensive sense, he doesn't have that restraint. He won't sit back if he thinks he can push on. He's not a six, Paul Pogba. If I'm putting him anywhere, it's much closer to Bruno Fernandes's position than to the position of Fred or to McTominay. Now but he's even played on the left wing recently. He is by definition more of an attacking player, and he does well there. But against Wolverhampton Wanderers, of course, Manchester United had Fred next to Paul Pogba. So we had Fred on the left side, Paul Pogba on the right side of that double six, that pivot, whatever you want to call it, that midfield. And that left, we talk about balance a lot, and this is literally unbalanced. If you think about it in terms of where these players are going to play, it's more of a zigzag than two like a base. It's not flat. You've got one ahead of the other, and sometimes you can do that, but not in a game like this. Not in a game where you're going to struggle for possession, where there's going to be intensity, where there's going to be a lot of power heavy counter-attacking threats, as there are in this Wolverhampton Wanderers team. You need a lot more protection there. If you want to compare it to a Liverpool, for example, who very successfully use a shielded midfield, they always have two defensive members within that midfield, within that three. It's usually last season it was often Wijnaldum and Fabinho. This season it's been Henderson and Milner. It's been Henderson and Fabinho. And in the other game it was I can't even remember, but it was a combination of one of those players. Against Chelsea it was Henderson and Fabinho. And they both have to be defensive. They have to be in order to support either the attacking wing backs or the more advanced player, in this case Harvey Elliott pushing up as a number 10, Robertson or Alexander-Arnold. You have to have that shield to protect your defence. And with Manchester United employing Fred and Pogba, you just don't have that. And that essentially without allocating any blame, that is essentially an issue with Paul Pogba because that's just not his position. He's he can play that role in a three, like if you had McTominay, if you had Fred, and if you had Pogba, he could push up in that role. But then you're taking Bruno Fernandes out of the equation, unless you're putting him literally as a false nine or a more forward player, not the 10 or the part of the midfield essentially. Um, then that's the only way you can play Paul Pogba really. And the same goes for Donny van der Beek because he's in that mould also. He's a naturally offensive-minded player. You've got Pogba, Fernandes, and Van der Beek who are all in the same bracket, whereas you've then got Fred, McTominay, and Matic who are in the same bracket. But when you start mixing and matching them within defensive positions, you get this imbalance and you get these holes. And for the first 15, maybe 20 minutes of the game against Wolves, we saw that hole.